This is a story of Harry Heels, a legend in this part of Leeds. Not that he was born in Leeds, he was born in York and served his apprenticeship as an engineer at the York City Transport Department. But when the Depression came along in the early 30s, 1934 I think to be precise, he and his great friend Ronnie Parkin had to go and keep working somewhere, so they came to Leeds and camped outside in tents going looking for jobs. Now they eventually finished up passing a fire station down in Leeds, and Ronnie, being the devil he was, he said, "That engine there looks as though it needs a big clean up, Harry. Why don't you go and see if they've got any jobs, any men?" So in went Harry, and the officer on chain there said, "Can I help you at all?" He said, "Yes, I'm looking for a job." He said, "I'm an apprentice trained engineer, and just wondered if there was anything possible going." So he said, "Do you think you could start that pump over there?" He said, "I think so." So he said, "Go on then." So an hour later the pump was going. The fire officer couldn't believe it. He said, "How tall are you?" He said, "Are you 5'10"? So I said, "Yeah, somewhere around that." So he said, "Fine." He said, "Do you think you could lift me up that and down that ladder?" So he said, "Yes, I think so." So there he did, and the guy came down and said, "Just hang on a minute, I'll go and see the station officer." And the station officer came out and I said, I hear you've passed this test, but how you've got that pump going without this rotor arm I've got in my pocket, I do not know." And to this day, nobody knows how Harry got that engine going without a rotor arm. Anyway, he said, "I don't suppose you can drive as well, can you?" He said, "Oh yes, that was all part of my apprenticeship." So he said, "Well lad," he said, "you're in luck today. You've got the job because our engineer died yesterday and we are desperate." And that's the way he came to be a fireman in Leeds. He was stationed down in Leeds until 1934, and in the meantime he'd met his future wife Violet whilst he was in the Leeds area. And of course when they came up here to the Gipton in 1937, a house was provided and they actually lived in house number 12 along outside, which is still there standing as bright as the button. The only thing that's changed around here is that where this gallery is now is where Harry's workshop was, and there he had great fun eventually when the children came along, working down in the pits, repairing motorbikes as dads and sons do, especially when the super facilities that are here. Anyway, when the war came along, Harry couldn't be left out with his mates, and eventually he decided he would join the RAF. And he was in the RAF only a couple of years, and he wrote home to his wife, very upset I would imagine, because he was actually servicing the aeroplanes as they came in with all the bits and pieces missing. But his great friend, who was a gunner, and he had died, and it must have been heartbreaking for him, to have to clean out what was left of his friends. And I think that affected his wife Violet more or as much as it affected him, because eventually he was posted back to home, one because the fire brigade needed him, and the other one because of his wife's medical condition. And that was the sad part about it, but there were lots of humorous moments, and certainly around the Leeds area Harry's reputation as an engineer, both in the RAF and out of the RAF, back here on his home territory, proved to be very fruitful for him in the long term, because Mr. Fattorini, who was a jeweller's around here, and the name still goes, had heard that Harry was the best engineer around and was recommended by Jaguar to look after his car. So this Jaguar used to appear at the fire station, and Harry used to service it, and Mr. Fattorini was very, very pleased. So much so that about 8-9 years later, Mr. Fattorini came in and said, "Harry, are you busy today?" He said, "Well, why don't you go for a ride in your new car? The car is now yours, you've looked after it for so long." That was the plus side from being an engineer and dedicated. Now then, what else can I tell you? Oh yes, behind me here I think you can see a triple turntable ladder, which was delivered here, and there must have been a need for it to be ordered, because that very night Harry was called out of bed to take this triple turntable ladder down to attend a fire at Leeds Central High School, where 3 firemen were actually trapped in the top floor science laboratory and couldn't get out. And Harry, in his pyjamas, took the wrappings off the triple turntable ladder and drove it down into Leeds along with a junior recruit, and they used this machine to crash through the roof to rescue the 3 firemen that were inside trapped, all in his pyjamas. The story goes that it was almost a roast chicken, but it ended well with the 3 firemen being rescued.
My name's Violet. I was married to a lovely man called Harry Heels. I actually was born in Rotherham and was one of 13 children. Oh, such a muddle at home sometimes. I went to work in Collinson's Cafe as a waitress, but really I'd like to have worked with shoes. Shoes were my thing. I met Harry in 1934 and we got married in 1937. Our son Rob was one of 5 children. Sadly, we did lose a daughter. I was part of the fire service, I joined, and I'll never forget my fire service number, 810077. I served from December 1941 until July 1945 as a leading firewoman. It was tough in the fire service, but I feel my sense of humour got me through. Harry's love of the service really encouraged me to join, so I was part of it. I said it was tough. It was, looking after children, full-time, no husband at home. It was an anxious time. It was wartime, all sorts of connotations. The final straw, though, was when Harry's best friend was killed. And then Harry told me how he'd had to spray him out of the cockpit. The thought of this was just all too much, too emotional. High-ranking police fire surgeon was requested to bring Harry back home to support me. I couldn't really manage anymore. I started to be ill, I was stressed, and I felt I just couldn't be alone. I struggled with depression. However, I managed to live till I was 90, so I didn't do bad, did I? I held on to my love of life. I enjoyed entertaining the family with mimicry. I was devoted to my family.
My first memory of Gipton was as an 18-year-old back in 1979. Yeah, I was an 18-year-old fireman and very raw to the job. The first thing I noticed, it was the smell on, I think it was a mixture, smoke on the tunics and a mixture of the polish on the parquet flooring. I could smell it even now as I'm speaking. And it was from the muster bay and the appliances and the mixture of all those smells, and they've stayed with me. After a while, I stopped noticing the smells as me and my colleagues just got used to it. But every now and again, I'd go into a storeroom and I could sense it, I could smell it, and it stayed with me right up until now. And it just brings back so many memories of that day and right up even to now. One of the stories I recollect is back in the 80s, and we all knew the hospital that was called Jimmy's. They'd even made a programme about it. But this particular night, I was called out as there'd been a fire. It was on the elderly ward, and me and my colleagues were called out down to Leeds 9, St James's. I think it was called Ashley Wing. And what was funny was the nurses had been evacuating people that night. By the time we got there, most of the people had been evacuated. But I do recall I was trying to reassure a lot of the nurses that night, as was my other colleagues. But there was one particular nurse who struck me. She seemed a bit fearful. It had actually been reported on national television. And I remember speaking to her, and she just happened to rummage through her pockets, and guess what she brought out? I think she brought out a set of false teeth, because probably one of the elderly patients, she might have just felt more as if she was looking well enough for the cameras, just in case she was on TV. Sadly, out of all those people, I think there was one elderly man who'd sadly lost his life. But it was a very eventful night. After a morning spent swapping all the equipment over, the duty driver for the day asked us to take it for a test drive to get acquainted, he said. We'd only driven it down Gipton Approach when the brakes failed. So it's brought back to the station, had all the equipment taken off it, and unceremoniously sent to the workshop at the rear. It displayed a badge on the front which read, "Built by Gipton, West Yorkshire Fire Service Workshops." And I thought it funny to add underneath, "and scrapped at Gipton." Unbeknown to me, the Deputy Chief Fire Officer, Transport Manager and several other high-ranking officers were on the way to Gipton to make sure we'd commissioned it, driven it and got acquainted with it to see what it was all the fuss was about. When they saw the additional comments, we were all ordered into the lecture room. I owned up to doing it. The DCFO was livid, to say the least. But he declared that we didn't deserve it and that it would be sent to Moortown Station. A large cheer went up and the look on his face, well, I wasn't in Moortown's good books for many months after that. We adopted a dog in the 80s. If I recall rightly, I think Andy took it home and we named it Wobbly after Ron, the ADO at the time. Bob got upset when it turned out that in the middle of the night one time he found it asleep on his tunic. It were laid on the engine cow as well in the appliance, and there were others who used to bring their dogs to work, such as Graham, but Wobbly the dog, I'd forgotten about him. All the drivers had to be careful because you could have easily run him over with one of the engines. I think we had Wobbly for 17 happy years. But we did rename him, as I recall, Smudge. When we got her, she was so gentle, unless a big dog annoyed her. She would just freeze for a minute, putting on a kind of a big dog, brave face, but even though she was tiny. But when she was threatened with a bigger dog, she turned into a snarling Gipton Terrier. I used to love it when big doggy owner said, "It's all right, it's my dog. Won't hurt yours." She saw off Dobermans, Rottweilers and you name it.
It's common knowledge that firemen from Gipton in Leeds attend a vast number of emergency calls every year, more so than all the other stations in the immediate vicinity. For this reason, they have become folk heroes. These men, they serve their time at Gipton, are living legends.
This is the story of the Commandos. Following the publication of the Brigade's magazine, I think in the summer of 1985, there followed a daring raid on FSHQ, perpetrated by 4 deadly commandos, who shall at this time remain anonymous. As far as I can recall, and I wasn't involved, it was the final dining in night for the recruit courses that were underway at the time. Many civic dignitaries were there in attendance, including the Lord Lieutenant of West Yorkshire. The Chief Fire Officer received a frantic phone call informing him that the commandos had struck at HQ. The, unknown at the time, raiding party had, using stealth tactics, removed the Union Jack flag which was flying over the drill square at the training centre and replaced it with their own. It is rumoured that the recruits were woken very early the following morning and disciplined, very severely as well for their part in the action, much to their annoyance. The flag was eventually returned and hung on the recreation room wall, but it was later stolen and held to ransom, probably by some lowlifes from Leeds Fire Station. A huge sum of money had to be donated to the Build a Bungalow appeal at Killingbeck Hospital for its safe return. One of the stunts we used to pull, this were a belter this, we used to wait while one of our colleagues were going on a 2-week holiday, and when he were going for a shower, obviously he'd have his locker open and we and some of the lads would get a jar full of maggots and throw them down into the locker. And I don't know if you can imagine this, but 2 weeks later on their return, we'd get everybody gathered round, and as soon as they opened the locker door, the room would be filled with flies.